All right, welcome back into our live stream today. It is going to be a fun one. We are going to dive in deep on XRP and the Ripple case with the SEC. And one thing that we've done on this show before is really kind of break down the analysis of where the case stands, also the class action lawsuit, the involvement of what we've seen with Hinman and the SEC, and all these things that has kind of become a little bit of a drama, I feel like, around what's happening in the legal sphere around XRP. But we're going to dive deep. My name is Paul Barron. Welcome back to Tech Path. Joining me today is a channel frequent now, I think, guest, and that is John Deaton, coming over from Deaton Law. So great to have you back, John.
Hey, Paul. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so good stuff. And just for our audience, because we are live streaming, is that for you guys that if you want to get some questions in, make sure and put them in the live chat. We'll try to get those over to John, and we'll kind of translate those in through, and we can get some commentary on some questions for you guys. So it's the first time maybe that you've got a chance to actually get live to John, especially around what's happening with the Ripple case. John, let's get an update quickly of where the case currently stands and your thoughts on how, let's say if you had to give it a score right now, neutral, positive, negative, what would that be?
Well, right now we're sort of in a stand still period because expert discovery has been extended until the end of February. So I would anticipate that there's not a lot of motion activity that you're going to see filed on the docket until the end of those depositions. That was extended by the court again to the end of February. You know, where it's going, I put a lot of emphasis, Paul, on the ruling of the deliberative process privilege and whether or not that ruling could potentially lead to a settlement or cause even potential more delay, because the SEC can appeal certain decisions made by the court, by Judge Netburn. So I was hoping for more. For example, there was a June 13th, 2018 legal memo that analyzed XRP by staff attorneys from the SEC. Basically, they do a Howey analysis. Is XRP a security? Was it a security before, and then it's not today, and things of that nature? And that has been ruled privileged. That's never going to be turned over. But very interestingly, when you read the judge's decision, she takes note that no recommendation was made by the SEC staff attorneys. What that says to me, Paul, is that there's no conclusion, that says XRP is definitely a security today and we recommend an enforcement action. And that was 2018. So that's me speculating a bit, but that's sort of by reference, right? Had there been a recommendation, the judge wouldn't have said that. So whether or not the SEC led to more discovery, whether it was inclusive, who knows? I was hoping for that to be turned over. It's not. But ultimately, a lot of people have scored it like 2 for the SEC, 1 for Ripple. It was, whenever you get any documents from the SEC, it's a win because the SEC usually wins. And the judge basically said that the email, and there were 63 of them, Paul, that went around that had the draft speech that contained, Ether is not a security speech, that is discoverable because it is his personal opinion, and the SEC sort of disavowed it as official SEC guidance or declaration. And so she ruled that comes in. And that's very interesting because I kind of believe that in those 63 emails going back and forth, is XRP mentioned? Is there an analysis? We know, for example, did someone say, well, if Ether today isn't a security, then what about XRP? There could be those types of give and takes, which would be exculpatory for Ripple. It would help them in their fair notice defense. And so that's a huge win. The other win for Ripple was that the judge said any notes about what these third parties said at meetings, has to be turned over. She said that the SEC can still redact that if it goes to what the SEC lawyers believe. So here's an example. We know that consensus met in December of 2017 and three or four times with Joe Lubin, for example. We know that the Ether investors met in on March 28th from the legal memo that was sent to Bill Hinman. At those meetings, notes of what those third parties said are not privileged. So did XRP come up in those meetings with these investors asking for a free pass? And so it's a win for Ripple, no doubt, to get anything turned over by the SEC. Now, of course, the SEC, as you know, has filed a motion to reconsider. They want the judge to look at other documents because they're taking this kind of dual approach to say, well, it was only Bill Hinman's personal opinion, but because he got a lot of input from fellow SEC staff members or employees, that should be protected. Now, that seems a bit inconsistent. It's either a personal opinion or it's official guidance. And that's the fence that they're straddling.
Yeah. So, okay, so my question to you, maybe this is from a legal standpoint. In a case like this, where you have a high-ranking SEC official, and this could happen in any kind of business law out there, where their personal opinion and the way that they're speaking, usually on behalf, because they're carrying the title, on behalf of the SEC, they carry the title into these conferences or into a book or other aspects that are, public-facing. And if they go into presenting personal opinion on that, how does that flow over into official analysis or opinion? Would the judge look at that and say, let's say that it's a damning element that we find from those emails that Hinman in fact was thinking in this direction? Is that enough for a judge to say, okay, this is starting to show influence on the case in a contradictory measure?
Oh, absolutely. And two, remember also the judge has ruled that the fair notice defense is an objective standard that you follow. So the SEC can claim it's his personal opinion, but the question is, what impact did it have on market participants? So when he goes on CNBC and says, we at the SEC find this, we at the SEC do not believe present day sales of Ether are a security. When Jay Clayton then gives a speech a month or two later and says, we at the SEC agree with Bill Hinman. It really is official guidance. The SEC is simply trying to have it both ways here, right? They don't want to support this defense of Ripple's that says that, yes, you could rely on the speech and believe that since XRP Ledger is sufficiently more decentralized or is equally decentralized as the Ether network, therefore you get a pass. They want to avoid that, and so they call it Bill Hinman's personal opinion. And now they're faced with, of course, well, if it's his personal opinion, then turn over the documents, and that's where we're at. But you're on point. It could absolutely help the Ripple defense entirely. I mean, think of it this way from common sense. The SEC could go to Ripple and say, here are the documents, but we want them protected from the public. So the only people, it would be sealed, like many things are sealed, Paul, right? Yeah. The public wouldn't get to see it. The world wouldn't get to see it. Only the lawyers who would be subject to a protective order or confidentiality provisions would get to see it. And so why not turn it over? Why keep fighting and fighting and fighting? So it's got to mean, in my opinion, that there's something in there damning against to the SEC and this whole Ether free pass and things of that nature, or it's exculpatory, which is really going to help Ripple win, or it could be both.
Yeah. John, okay, so for some of our audience, maybe they don't completely understand some of the dominoes that are in effect in this little bit of a game here that's moving back and forth between Hinman, the SEC, the involvement of Consensus, the involvement of a lot of third-party actors that had some influence on this whole run-up to where we are today. Kind of paint that picture for our viewers.
Sure, thank you, appreciate that. So here's the thing to know, that in December 13th, 2017, Bill Hinman schedules a meeting with Joe Lubin and Consensus, and they're of course represented by Sullivan and Cromwell, which is Jay Clayton's law firm.
Yeah.
And the day after that, the general counsel for Consensus publicly says, we are building an alliance with the SEC. And then from that period of time until all the way up to June 8th, 2018, 1 week before the free pass speech, there are between 5 and 6 meetings. We also know that on January 25th, Jay Clayton went to Andreessen Horowitz, Chris Dixon, and said, listen, assemble an industry working group and create a memo of what you want us to do. And basically, led by the law firm of Perkins Coie, they established a memo, and we have that memo, and a safe harbor provision. And they basically only mention one crypto in that, and that is Ether. And we know that that was presented to Bill Hinman. And from that moment, we know there's these 63 emails going back and forth about the draft of what's going to be said in that email. But most importantly, after the speech was given, the lead attorney, his name is Lowell Ness from Perkins Coie, he's on video, and he stands up and says that the Hinman's speech followed his memo. And these are the Ether investors who are lobbying for the SEC to give, a safe harbor provision.
Right.
And then, of course, on June 14th, 2018, Bill Hinman gives the speech. And then, of course, we get into all the conflicts, right? And if you want me to get into that, I will. Or if you want to, I'll leave it up to you.
No, I do want to get into the conflicts, but also timing, because there were some key position step downs right there at the SEC as this case was being launched. Just the timing of some of these elements, including the issue with Hinman, and his whole professional career. Explain those elements, because I think timing here is huge.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad that you brought it up, because a lot of people lose sight of this. Basically, we all can agree, Paul, that this lawsuit is arguably the most significant non-fraud securities enforcement action case in decades, right? In decades. It involves digital currency. How big is that in today's finance world? And so on Clayton's last day, he drops this bomb of a lawsuit against Ripple. And they claim not only did Ripple sell illegal securities in the early years, but today's XRP is in fact, let me get out of this light. Today's XRP is in fact sorry, I'm running into, we're live. This always happens live. That today's XRP, today's XRP is a security. But Bill Hinman left just a couple weeks before that. Clayton leaves on his last day. The director of enforcement, who was predominantly behind this lawsuit being filed, he left and he goes to Hinman's law firm, Simpson Thacher. The director of trading and markets left. And Joseph Grunfest, who helped Ether, he's a very impartial person. He actually helped the Ether investors himself. He wrote a letter on December 17th to Jay Clayton and all the commissioners, pleading with them, do not file this lawsuit because you are going to destroy innocent holders of XRP. He even said what you're getting to, Paul. He said, never in the history of the SEC has there been a, quote, mass exodus of leadership at the SEC that was behind the lawsuit. And he said, by doing this, by dropping this lawsuit, and all of those people walking out the door as they leave the SEC forever, he said it, quote, raises obvious concerns. He also said that it was unfair because there was no material distinction made ever between Ether and XRP, and that if you allow Ether to be traded today, you must allow XRP. And he raised all that. And that letter, which is, I have it, and I got it from a FOIA battle with the SEC. It's a bombshell, Paul. When you read it, I could try to articulate what it says like I have, but when you read it yourself, you're going to go, wow.
Yeah, I think that's the thing is as you peel back, the layers of the onion here, there just seems to be more and more really rolling into what is on the side of Ripple in the essence of potentially either a settlement or a win here. And especially with these, these most recent findings and what we will see coming up in the month of February as the start of the case starts to really roll out. What are your thoughts on how, okay, so let's assume that let's take the side that there's something damning or incriminating, within those documents, within that, those emails that essentially would eliminate the issue of the SEC being able to make this claim against Ripple and XRP, of course. If that is the case, how quickly would we see either a settlement or a judge maybe just saying, hey, I'm going to throw this case out?
Well, what normally happened, what I had said before was that if the DPP, the deliberative process privilege, that Ripple were going to get all these documents, I've said that a settlement could happen within 90 days of that decision. Now, what we have here, though, that was with the assumption that the documents would be turned over, or they would be forced to turn over. What people need to understand is the SEC is yet to be forced to turn it over. And so, for example, they filed the motion to reconsider her decision. If she stands by, when I say she, Judge Netburn, if she stands by her original decision and says the documents related, the emails, they come in and the other stuff comes in, then the SEC can write an objection to her decision to the judge presiding over the case, which is Judge Torres. And then Judge Torres would then it would take at least another month before she probably would rule, and she's either going to overrule Judge Netburn or she would agree with her. And then the question, Paul, is if Judge Torres sides with Judge Netburn and says these documents must be turned over, will the SEC attempt an appeal to the Second Circuit? So I wish I could come on here and say that, there's going to be any more delays, but I can't. If the SEC fights that hard, if after Judge Torres, assuming she does, rules that these documents must be turned over to Ripple, and the SEC still refuses, you could see a settlement again within 90 days. But that 90 days is from the time they must turn it over.
Right.
If the judge, and the way this would happen is the judge would say, you have 30 days to turn over the documents, and if you don't, then the case will be dismissed. That's what I think you were looking for. A lot of people were asking, well, what's the mechanism of when would the judge throw this out? If the SEC refuses to comply with her orders, she could dismiss the case with prejudice against the SEC.
So, okay, I guess there's a couple of positions here, because if you paint this out from a strategy standpoint or from a legal standpoint, the aspect of the SEC potentially saying, all right, we just aren't going to turn these documents over. Maybe there's other things within these documents that they don't want seen. And we see a scenario like that. In essence, the SEC could still come back to fight another day within the crypto space, could they not?
Sure. Even if there's a settlement, they could. What's sort of boggled my mind, Paul, is why haven't the SEC said to Ripple, we'll settle with you for these, you pay for some early transactions in 2013 or 2015. We agree that today's XRP is not a security. They get a hefty settlement from Ripple. They then get to brag that they held Ripple accountable and they got a settlement. And then they could go after another project if they want it, because they would avoid any kind of precedent set by a favorable Ripple ruling. And I think that's the other thing that can lead to a settlement for people wondering what will cause this case to go away. If the judge rules that Ripple can argue the fair notice defense, that's still pending, and that's a motion to strike it. And all that means is, can Ripple argue fair notice or not? And if she, as I hope, and I think she will, denies that, that means Ripple can argue fair notice. And then they read Ripple's brief on summary judgment. They read the brief I'm going to file on behalf of XRP holders. And now they look at we seriously think we're going to lose, right? There's a really good chance the judge is going to declare today's XRP is not a security, and maybe even find that XRP was never a security. if that written ruling comes out, then every pre-existing altcoin, in my opinion, is out of SEC jurisdiction, because then the SEC would only be able to go after ICOs, like pure ICOs that are started. But when you talk about, you know, the Cardanos and the XLMs and all the other ones out there, if they would basically have the Ripple blueprint of how to defeat the SEC and use that judge's ruling against them as precedent. And so when the SEC lawyers or Gary Gensler fear that and think, wow, we could be put out of business in the crypto regulation business, then I think there's a settlement.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm leaning in on. But at the same time, you look at what the value of XRP is and could have been during this period of time. There's real damages that have occurred into, obviously, your case, which is the class action representation of those holders. And with this case potentially continuing, let's say that it goes beyond this February, well, we know it's going to go beyond February, but let's say that it goes into second quarter of this year, and we still don't see a settlement, continuing to see damage, especially in the run that we're dealing with on crypto right now, and a lot of market adjustment and where that potentially could go. Doesn't this just continue to kind of compound or add insult to injury to the XRP holders?
Sure. And the thing is, we can't move forward any type of action, independent action against the SEC or others, really until there's a ruling on today's XRP, right? And what we need first and foremost is a declaratory judgment that secondary market sales of XRP are not securities as a matter of law. When we get that ruling, then the Coinbases of the world and the Krakens, they'll have confidence to relist it. And then maybe we'll try to figure out, you know, where we go from there. But until that happens, we're sort of in this purgatory, to borrow a word from Brad Garlinghouse, that that we have to wait. And it's going to be very interesting when this is all said and done, because you rely on experts to figure out what was the suppression. You know, I think most, and you're someone that, you know, could even be an expert in this kind of area. You know, what would XRP be today? You know, would it have seen its all-time high like the other cryptos? It's the only, in my, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's the only top 20 or 25 crypto by market cap that did not achieve an all-time high in the last, you know, run up, if you will. And so clearly that's indicative of suppression. But that's stuff that's going to have to all be meted out once this case is over.
Yeah, I was just going to jump to the chart real quick, because I think what you're talking about essentially is where it gets to this one right here, and the period in which we're dealing with most of the SEC, you know, impression really starting last summer was the pressure, and that's where we started to see a lot of this downward pressure into XRP. It tried to recover, but just never really did, and it's continued to see a fairly long slide. And even if you look at our chart here of where sentiment has continuously had this really downward slope, and even now we're down from 74, and I know the XRP army out there, you know, the people that are big fans of this project, they still kind of support it, and they support it, you know, I think very feverishly. But the point being is, even with that, we're continuing to see XRP sliding in the sentiment, which means that I'm looking at a little bit of fatigue in the market right now, for other reasons, of course. Yes, we have a little bit of crypto fatigue with Bitcoin as it is. But with that as being the case, do you feel like this is ever a recoverable project back to the state? Do you think it's going to take a landmark decision to really kind of resurrect what we're seeing here on Ripple's case?
Well, I think that we have to absolutely have the decision, and we have to have the relistings, in my opinion, for XRP to return to what it should be. I mean, look at it this way. Look at the announcements, Paul, that Ripple has come out with, right? The partnerships, they're buying up XRP in the secondary market. They're buying their own seed C investors out. And so you would think that if there was this correlation with Ripple, it would show the XRP price should be much higher than it is if it was truly correlated. It's more correlated to this lawsuit than anything, in my opinion.
For sure.
And when we get this clarity, then I do think that XRP will be able to recover. I don't know. We got to come up with a different phrase for the XRP army. They have something much more stronger than diamond hands, right? to deal with all of this for years and the suppression of the price and to stay firm. I mean, it's a testament, I think, to their belief in the technology. And that also goes to show that it's not about Ripple. If it was about Ripple, a lot of people would have checked out, and said, listen, the SEC's got Ripple on its target, and I'm going to check out. But they believe in the underlying technology, and so I think that we will get that one day. It's just, is it going to be the summer or is it going to be the fall?
Right, sure. Yeah, before we get to the live questions, John, I want to ask you one more question here, and that is, make sure, guys, by the way, get your live questions, and we'll try to address as many as we can. There's quite a few coming on through the stream, so we'll get to those. Last question for you, John. You look at politics in general. We're seeing a lot of movement, everything from the Biden administration looking at some executive orders to potentially cause some additional issues in the crypto space. This story right here, U.S. lawmakers have been loading up on Bitcoin, Ethereum, Cardano. We're seeing a lot more activity from the political side of the plate now. And it almost feels as though there is a little bit of movement. We've had Tom Emmers on our show before, who is a big proponent of digital assets and cryptocurrency in general. What are your thoughts on whether or not, especially DC, obviously we're going into an election year for this year, but we also are swinging into a presidential election in a couple of years. What are your thoughts on how all of this could start to really become a political play?
I've been calling it on Twitter, Paul, the crypto contingency. I think that crypto investors are going to speak. I think they're speaking now. In fact, if you don't mind, I established Connect to Congress on the Crypto Law site. And to give you an idea of how outspoken crypto investors are, we have 28,000 messages just from my little cryptolaw.us website, where you connect to the Congress. We have 100 senators have been contacted. Every House of Representatives been contacted. Again, 28,000 messages have been sent. Also, the international XRP holders, almost 16,000 have signed that petition. And so we're speaking out. If you look at the bills, Arizona state senator wanted Bitcoin to be deemed legal tender in Arizona. You see the governor's race in Texas, and you have multiple Bitcoin proponents and crypto opponents coming out. It'll be very interesting to see what's in this White House executive order. I fear that it's going to be restrictive and anti-crypto, but I'm hopeful that the Democratic Party that's in power now will see that this is a battle they don't want. The midterms are going to be hard enough for the incumbents. And I think if they choose the wrong side of this crypto debate, then it could be very bad news for them. And so I think we're going to speak loud.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the Ripple case has become kind of a pivotal point in not only American law history, but just in the essence of its timing with both the midterms and setting up what we could see in obviously the presidential election coming on. All right, John, I want to jump to a few questions because we got a few coming in here. And we also have a poll. Let's bring up that poll real quick. Just on this, let's see what we had. All right, so are you currently holding XRP? Yes, forever. Not worth it. I'm on the fence. Okay, so good. Excellent, which is, wow, 800 plus votes on that. That's great. All right, let's go to a couple of questions here. My senators and legislators are not feeling the pressure yet. We need millions to represent their holdings. I think what Mike is talking about here is really, obviously, you want to jump in to Connect to Congress. Are there other things or other movements, John, that you've seen out there in the space that are helping not only our senators and politicians really understand this beyond what we're seeing in the Ripple community?
You know, I would say that so far we've unfortunately been reacting. You know, for example, in the infrastructure bill, when there was the overbroad language of that was going to hurt crypto, even though it passed, you know, it was held up for several days because, from what we understand, there were over 60,000 phone calls were made to the U.S. senators and congressmen about that language, and so I think when you have the current chairman of the SEC refusing to publicly state whether or not he believes today's Ether is a security, when his predecessor did, when Bill Hinman did, when the speech is on the SEC website to this very day, when you have that, I think that now we're starting to see more of a coalition. What we need really desperately is the tribalism to end, and the common enemy, right? The enemy of my friend kind of concept that we mobilize together. That's what, unfortunately, I don't see happening, that I think needs to happen. You know,
Yeah.
the Ether, you know, believe it or not, XRP holders are upset about the Ether free pass, but right now let's fight the SEC together and not encourage the SEC to go after other projects. Like, that's what I'm trying to steer people toward.
Yeah, I think you're definitely on the right fence there when we see kind of the unification of what will be the digital assets and crypto market in the future. That's really the direction we need to go. One quick question for you before we let you go.
Sure.
Unrelated to, you know, obviously what's happening here, but digital assets have been looked at, you know, now being looked at for the first time, really under the scope and the ire of the Congress and potentially now the president, with executive orders pointing towards digital assets. Do you think digital assets projects like VV, what we're seeing in terms of the play to earn space for in-game assets that become valuable, how will those be related to or potentially at risk, if at all, depending on how this works out?
Well, I think people just really need, when you think about an investment contract and what's a security, just think about it, Paul. It's an investment with an expectation of profit in a common enterprise where you rely on efforts of others. Just think about how many things generally could fit into that category when you have a promoter. And so I think that, I don't think it's hyperbole for me to say that the result in this Ripple SEC case could, if it goes the way that the SEC wants it, then what you just described would be in jeopardy as well.
Yeah, I
absolutely believe that.
Yeah, that's the big question to me, because I think a lot of people, like your point that you were making there, is that some people are, and we still see the tribalism in the crypto space. Everybody's for their token. They want to pump their project. You know, I understand that. But the real freedom potential here is digital assets, cryptocurrency, as a real shift in the economic system around what the globe will most likely be doing. I'm just curious, your thoughts on whether or not this pushback and defense mechanism that's being played at from both the SEC standpoint and also from what will be regulatory standpoints, is this going to hold back the United States from really accelerating in growth in technology and potentially, you know, great profits and potentially, you know, prosperity for their citizens? What are your thoughts on how that's going to play out?
I think we're at a significant crossroads. I could tell you that I have no doubt whatsoever that the SEC will not stop if they're successful with Ripple. I mean, I believe we're going to see a lawsuit from the SEC against the exchanges, and it could come down any day now. And I think that Gary Gensler has stated that he's going to target the exchanges, and they do that, Paul, without telling you what the exchange is doing wrong. So, for example, they'll say, you know, Coinbase or Kraken, you're selling unregistered securities. We're not going to tell you which ones, though. We're just going to attack you and say it. And so that's going to chill innovators. You have people today, I know several businesses that are avoiding the US and they're focusing their entire efforts on the overseas markets. And that is because it's too costly, it's too uncertain. And we go into the SEC, we ask for advice, they don't give us advice, but we get a subpoena 3 weeks later. You know, when you have that kind of enforcement being what the SEC is promoting, they're not promoting innovation, they're not promoting compliance, they're promoting enforcement, and that will chill innovators and businesses and entrepreneurs. You know, you can't start a business if you need $15 million in attorney's fees up front.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think to your point exactly is that we are seeing innovation potentially being thwarted, even though at the same time I feel like this is really putting a lens on the SEC that a lot of most Americans have not seen before. Wait a minute, they're going after this company and it's caused, you know, these kind of things. I mean, there's not really a scenario here, I think, where now the general public is starting to look at, wait a minute, we're now falling behind the rest of the world around technology adoption, what could be, you know, cryptocurrency in terms of a future down the road. John, it's always great having you on the show. Thank you so much for stopping in. We appreciate your time today.
I appreciate you, Paul. Looking forward to you. Bye-bye.
All right. Excellent. Are you guys, you tuned in here? Thank you so much. Again, thanks for the comments here. A lot more questions here. I think, you know, John really hit on a lot of points here, is that there still is a long way to go here, but there are some good signs, I think, in the sense of what is being kind of recovered from the side of the defense, you know, when it comes to Ripple's case. And I think there are some good things to be watching for. The big question I have is going to be for not only cryptocurrency and the timing for XRP, and whether or not this plays out into another maybe altcoin run for you guys who are looking at investment approaches toward this. But it's definitely going to be one that is going to be close to at least our vest in terms of watching. So we're going to keep trying to bring back more experts on XRP's position, but maybe how this also could play out in the future. So we'll definitely get John back on the show. All right, you're listening in over on the podcast right now. Make sure and tune over here to YouTube, because this is the place where you're going to get all the insights, our charts, a lot of our breakdown on our CPI, which is our crypto power index. And not only that, great interviews like this where you'll really get a chance to dive in the minds of some of the best experts and people in the crypto space that are leading this evolution of our financial system, which soon will be a revolution, I think, in terms of growth. So make sure and tune in there, and make sure and join the Diamond Circle. Click the link below. If of course you guys want to reach me, it's out on Twitter @Paul Barron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechBath.